People are still coming in, I'm noticing, but they can join us. As I know, it's been a
Yeah, bless their hearts for sticking with us.
yeah, um, exactly. Well, um, thanks to everybody who has been here all day, and also for anybody who has just joined us for the keynote talk of our One Sun Rose on Us Today conference, sponsored by University of Maine at Augusta and USM. I am Lisa Botchin, professor of English at the University of Maine at Augusta, and the woman in blue to some side of me probably that you hopefully see is Lisa Walker, who Associate Professor of English and Associate Dean at the University of Southern Maine. And we are joined by Monica Wood, who is our keynote speaker. So I'll just give a just brief introduction and then let her take the floor. We are going to have Q&A at the end, so feel free to post any questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen, or in the chat. So I think probably many of you are probably familiar with Monica Wood, who is an award-winning best-selling novelist and short story writer and memoirist. Her books include When We Were the Kennedys, which the entire community of UMA read a few years ago and taught, and so we feel like we kind of own that story, and a story we also love. She's also the author of My Only Story and Secret Language, among many other things. She was born to an Irish Catholic family in the paper mill town of Mexico, Maine, and has worked in a variety of positions. Is also a musician and sings jazz, country, pop, gospel. I don't know if there's anything else I'm missing there. And an avid bird watcher. But she also has cats, so, you know.
It is a problem.
So we're so thankful that she is joining us here today as our keynote speaker. I will cede the floor to her, but I do want to thank my colleague Lisa Walker once again for working on this whole thing with me today, because this is not possible without one's friends and colleagues. So thank you, Lisa, and we will give the floor to Monica.
Thank you, both Lisas, so much for inviting me. I don't normally attend conferences of this type, but oh my goodness, it was a really interesting, enlightening, and entertaining day. I'm very happy that I could participate. It's been a day of stories, some of them tragic, some of them heartrending, some of them funny, all of them very moving. We heard about the role of the Wabanaki in the heyday of Maine's potato industry, both as potato pickers. Apparently, a good potato picker could pick 90 barrels a day. They called it stoop labor for a reason. And also as providers of strong, sturdy, beautifully made potato baskets. We heard about a Lithuanian Jew who fled the horror of the Cossacks in his homeland and eventually found his true artistic home in Maine. That was William Zorak. And we heard an entertaining story about a queer person being outed by a beverage. He probably had to be there. And some delightful and enthusiastic stories about a gay bar in Portland that changed lives. These stories have done what stories have done since the beginning of humankind, which is to bring us news, to bring us warnings, to bring us hope, to bring us together. So I would like to begin with a couple of stories of my own. Story number one is about the loveliest letter I ever received from a reader, which arrived a couple of years after my second novel was published. So this would have been almost 20 years ago now. And by the way, it came via US mail, handwritten, which all by itself gives this story staying power for me. Anyway, it was from a woman who had recently gone to Seattle, Washington to help out her mother after her father's death, to assist in tidying up his affairs, which apparently were quite complicated and burdensome. She wrote to me that her mother and she had never been especially close, but one thing they were really good at together and had always liked to do together was to read novels aloud, switching off narrator as they went. They had done this since the daughter was a little girl, and it was the one way that the daughter felt they could enjoy their time together with no mother-daughter baggage. So after several fraught days of a wake and a funeral and various family coming in and out of town, the daughter found herself alone with her mother one evening. It was raining. This woman could really set a scene. It's evening, it's raining, the clock is ticking in the background, and they ran out of things to say to each other. So the daughter starts glancing around the room, and on her mother's bookshelf, she spots a copy of my second novel, which she had sent to her mother as a gift for the previous Mother's Day. So the daughter says, "Hey, Mom, what did you think of that book?" Thinking maybe they could at least spend some time discussing a piece of fiction. But the mother said, "Oh, I actually never got around to reading it, sorry." At which point the daughter seized her opportunity, and over the next few evenings, after days spent dealing with the affairs of the deceased, they read the book aloud to each other. Now, in that book, there is a description of a fraught marriage and a sudden departure. And as the mother read that scene, she stopped. And instead of reading further, she told the daughter about a fraught time in her own marriage, a time that she had never revealed to anybody. And this secret became an occasion of strong bonding between the daughter and the mother, who had never been close. And the daughter was writing to me to thank me for creating that occasion. So I'm sure you can imagine how this letter affected me. I cried, of course, and to this day, I think of that woman whose mother is probably also gone by now. And I wonder if she perhaps reads books with her own daughter or a niece or maybe a neighbor child. In other words, the story really stuck with me. The second story, I am 19 years old, a college student in Washington, D.C., very far from my hometown of Mexico, Maine, very, very far in every possible way. And my friend Sally Jacobson and I came into a pair of tickets to hear the poet Rod McEwen, who was a very big deal in the 70s. He was going to give a reading at Constitution Hall. Now, we didn't know at the time, but he was going to be reading from his new book of poems, which included poems about the death of his mother. Now, Sally's mother had recently died, and my mother was very ill and would be gone within the year. So the two of us, these two 19-year-old girls, went to Constitution Hall, and I can still see exactly where we were sitting, stage right, about 6 rows back. And we sat there together for an hour and a half, holding hands, bawling our eyes out, as Rod McEwen, of all people, spoke directly to our broken hearts. For the two of us, in that moment, Rod McEwen was the greatest poet in the history of language. Now, most poets I know consider Rod McEwen a pretty dreadful poet. Sudsy, sentimental, highly commercial, a showman above all else. But for Sally and me, he was the perfect poet for us in that time, in that place. The book he was reading from was the perfect book for us in that time and in that place. Just as my second novel, which is a good novel, but not a great novel, not my best novel, but it was the perfect novel for that mother and daughter in Seattle, Washington, in their time and their place. Books are funny that way. The writer writes the words, the reader reads or hears the words, and only when those two things meet, the given writer and the given reader, does the book become animate. It's not just a thing on a shelf. It's something bigger than that. And the book is different depending on who the given reader is, where they are in their lives, what triumph or tragedy they have just gone through. I've come to believe that if I write one book and 100,000 people read it, then I have in effect written 100,000 books, not one. And in that sense, I think of books as living things, and writing them is a tremendous joy and privilege. Now, I think that stories told orally work exactly the same way. And we heard a lot of stories like that today about our beloved state of Maine from many different perspectives. Being a Mainer means different things to different people. Maine is not a perfect place, though on a gorgeous day in June, it certainly seems like that. But it's our place. It's the place that speaks to each of us in a different way. And just as readers bring their individual journeys to a given book, we bring our individual journeys to this state. And when that happens, Maine becomes much more than just trees and rocks and rivers and ocean and mountains. It becomes our place. It means something specific and unique to us. It becomes our history. It becomes our hopes. It becomes an essential part of our own individual story. And I don't know if this happens in other states, but there really does seem to be something about Maine that brings out that feeling. Maybe it's because we're at the tippy end of the country, or maybe because the sun rises on us first. I don't know, but it feels real. And I sensed it again over and over again today. Because today has been at heart about storytelling. And because we humans are an animal species with ancient survival instincts that served us very well millennia ago, those same instincts too often register as a fear of otherness. And because of that fear, storytelling necessarily involves tragedy and persecution and pain and bigotry. Within the past few years in Maine, a big, bright light has been shining on some of those stories, including those of the Wabanaki, whose history is tragically entwined with our government's gruesome treatment of Native peoples. But guess what? They are still here, telling their stories. And finally, now more than ever, I think, people seem willing to listen. The concept of identity is often disparaged as identity politics, but claiming your identity is at its root simple storytelling at the most basic human level. This is my story. Please listen. And some of those stories are hard to listen to. And we have had a blizzard of them in this past year and a half in our country, with the trans community and the indigenous community and the Black Lives Matter movement insisting that these stories be told and insisting that these stories be heard. And I still grapple every day with the impact of these stories, trying to hear them and absorb them with openness and curiosity rather than defensiveness and denial. And to be completely honest, defensiveness was my first instinct. And I would love to blame a 50,000-year-old ancestor for that. I'm trying to understand what privilege means, not just in the abstract, but in my own life as a white citizen of the United States of America in the year 2021. It's a journey that I know a lot of us have taken this past year, And for me, this conference feels like not the end of that journey by any means, but like an important resting spot, a reflection place for absorbing all of the hard truths that as a responsible member of the human race, I have been asked to take in, story by story, over the past year and a half. And I am grateful for this reflection time. I consider it yet another example of the perfect experience coming to a person in their particular time and their particular place. I was invited to speak today because of a memoir I wrote called When We Were the Kennedys, which describes a Maine that many people, even some Mainers, are unfamiliar with. The story takes place in Mexico, a paper mill town on the Androscoggin River in the foothills of the White Mountains. The year is 1963, when I was a 9-year-old attending St. Teresa's Catholic Elementary School. The story opens on a lovely April morning when my father, who worked at what was then called the Oxford Paper Company, suddenly dies on his way to work, leaving my mother with 3 young daughters, one of them intellectually disabled, to raise by herself. Our older brother is married with children of his own at that time, and our older sister, Anne, a teacher at the local high school, who would be my teacher years later when I got to high school, steps in to hold up our grief-stricken family. We also have a priest uncle, Father Bob, who becomes a father figure for these fatherless little girls. This story of a family loss and recovery from loss is entwined with 2 other stories. One is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy that happened a little later in the same year. And the other is the beginning of a long labor strike at the paper mill. And it's how those 2 events affected our family experience. The other thing about this time and place in Maine history is the diversity in these rural industrial towns that people don't generally think of as diversity. We were all white, mostly Catholic or some other form of Christian. I think we had 1 Jewish family in town. But the town came into being at the turn of the 20th century because of a cluster of mills built and owned by a guy named Hugh Chisholm, who was a visionary entrepreneur from Canada who saw great potential in the powerful cascade of water rushing over the Rumford Falls. And as a result, our town consisted almost exclusively of immigrants who came for these mill jobs. French Canadians with names like Doucet and Thériault and Poirier and Pelletier and Arsenault, Italians with names like Papsadora and DeConzo and Rosano and Puglia, Lithuanians with names like Stasulis and Mortis and Mazalski and Venskas, and Irish with names like Murphy and Mooney and Wood. I'm not sure if this would even count as diversity these days. There was almost no racial difference between anybody, but there was certainly a great diversity in language and place of origin and tradition. In the early part of the century, in fact, the foremen at the mills had a practice of manning the machines with men from different countries. They could barely communicate anyway over the roar of the machines, but the idea was that if you didn't speak each other's language, then you could not talk about unionizing. So there was a great advantage to some in the melting pot that was Mexico, Maine at that time, and the diversity was not lost on them. By the time I was a child growing up there, many of my friends had grandparents who spoke only French or only Lithuanian or only Italian or only English with an Irish or a Scottish brogue. The town had so many different European and Canadian traditions of food and language, music, storytelling, and we kids who went to the same schools were exposed to these various traditions through each other and through each other's families. In the school I went to, St. Teresa's, we learned prayers in French, and I still say prayers in French to this day. We greeted our teachers every day in French. I insinuated myself so thoroughly into the family of my best friend, Denise Valancourt, whose people came from French Canada, that to this day, people who have read the memoir, if it's been, a year or two since they read it, they recall that I grew up French Catholic instead of Irish Catholic, which I get a huge kick out of because, believe me, there was a difference. When I went out on tour for this book, a tour that took me across the country and back twice, I could not imagine how a memoir from a place nobody had ever heard of could possibly resonate with readers who had not grown up exactly as I had. I truly believed that the story had no traction whatsoever beyond the boundaries of Maine, and I could not have been more wrong. What I came to understand as I met readers from all ages and backgrounds is that when you tell a family story, you are in one way or another telling everybody's family story. Because we all come from families. And if you come from a family, you will find a door to open in the story of somebody else's family. Not everybody opened the same door, of course. Some people said, oh my goodness, I loved your book because it brought me straight back to the Kennedy era, which I remember so well, the clothes and the songs and the cars. Or they might say, I completely related because I also come from a big Catholic close family. Or they might say, I also grew up with a handicapped sibling, so I know exactly what that's like. Or they might say, I also came from a company town. We didn't make paper, but we made blankets or buttons or shoes or shirts. Or if they're talking about the present day, they say we make computer chips or we make semiconductors or trucks. It continually surprised and delighted me how many people could find common ground in a story that I had heretofore thought of as too personal to resonate. But even after I realized how universal this story really was, there were still a few surprises. And one of those surprises came in Austin, Texas. It was one of those weeks where I was in Santa Rosa on Tuesday, Milwaukee on Wednesday, Cleveland on Thursday. And when I finally got to Texas, the plane was late, so I had to go straight from the airport to the venue, which was a college. So I didn't really even have time for it to occur to me what it meant for me to be in Austin until I was walking over to the lectern to read the prologue of my book, which is how I always started my talks. And I looked out and I saw that the audience was composed largely of students, and that those students were largely the children of Mexican immigrants, students who were at that moment fulfilling their parents' dream for them, just as we kids in the other Mexico had fulfilled our parents' dream for us. I have to admit I was a little nervous because the first line of the prologue to When We Were the Kennedys is this: in Mexico, Maine, where I grew up, you couldn't find a single Mexican. And then a few lines later, I describe my confusion when learning in the fourth grade that the world included a country called Mexico. And I wondered how on earth they had named it themselves after us. So to my relief, both lines got a good laugh. And I thought, okay, I've got a nice audience here. They're with me. But then things got very quiet as I continued with the prologue, which is a few pages that describes my father's immigrant journey and the journey of so many of the parents in our small mill town, the dreams they had for us, sacrifices they made for us. And near the end of the prologue, there's this passage when I'm talking about the paper mill that employed just about everybody. My father made his living there, and my friends' fathers, and my brother, and my friends' brothers, and my grandfather, and my friends' grandfathers. They crossed the footbridge over the river's tainted waters, carrying their lunch pails into the mill's overheated gullet, 5, 6, sometimes 7 days a week. In every household in town, the story we children heard, between the lines, from mothers, fathers, memes and pepes, nanas and nonas, Implied in the merest gesture of the merest day was this: the mill called us here to have you. Now, as I finished, I'm looking out at this audience, and they are decades younger than me. But I realized that by telling a story from my own life, 50 years past, I was telling their story in the immediate present. Here they were, first generation, parents leaving everything to come to a new place to find better jobs, trying to do better for their kids. It was an astounding thing to realize in that very visceral way, with these faces looking at me in recognition. I had some conversations with some of the students later that confirmed my feeling that we had trod unexpectedly similar paths. The other surprise came, not in one place, but in every place, absolutely everywhere. At the end of so many of my talks or readings, people came up to me afterwards to get a book signed or say hello, but mainly what they wanted was to tell me who they had lost. This was the one door every person could open. They would say, I too lost my dad at age 9, or I lost my grandmother when I was 11, or I lost my twin brother when I was 19. I lost my mother last month, and even though she was 92, I'm devastated. It was extremely moving, like testimony, and I felt deeply grateful that my book was the occasion for that testimony. As we saw throughout the stories this morning, loss is the great equalizer, the one thing that we humans will certainly endure if we live long enough. Sometimes loss comes early, sometimes late, but it surely comes to all of us. And the people at my readings were taking this opportunity to acknowledge and testify to that basic human fact. So on a day like today, when many different people are essentially saying, this is my story, please listen, I think it's good and right to be reminded about the things that connect us only because we are all human, and to resolve to notice those connections, not only on this day, but on every day. A few years ago, I spent a couple of weeks in the country of Benin in West Africa. It's a tiny little country between Togo and Nigeria. It's about the size of Maine with 9 times the population. Desperately poor, largely illiterate, warm and generous people, a nation of enthusiastic smilers and handshakers. You could not get into or out of a meeting without shaking everybody's hand on the way in and then shaking everybody's hand on the way out. You couldn't go up a set of stairs without shaking the hand of somebody passing by you. It was just the way they roll. And it was really, it just made you feel extremely welcome. So I was there with my childhood friend, Denise Valancourt, whose career brings her often to West Africa for various health initiatives. But I had never been in a place anywhere remotely like this. And everything about it seemed utterly, utterly foreign, including the food, the heat, the bats, the spiders. Oh my gosh, the spiders the size of hamsters, the huge sky, everything was new to me. The official language there is French, which Denise speaks fluently. And of course, there are dozens of tribal languages as well. But the official language there is French. And my French is passable, but not great. And the French spoken there is rapid and very heavily accented. So for the first day, I could not understand one single thing anybody was saying to me, except bonjour. But within a day, after I kind of sussed out what the accent was, I realized that they were doing to the language, it was similar to the Quebecois French I grew up hearing all around me in Mexico. So the clouds parted And within a day, the French sounded more familiar. It had that twang, and they had a way of clipping the ends of words. So it became comprehensible to me, and I did okay after that. So Denise and I spent the first week in Cotonou, which is relatively, very, very relatively urban. And then we headed up country to visit some of the villages. So it would be like driving from York to Holton, except on terrifying roads. So around midday on the first day, we were driving through this little village when I spotted a woman and a group of girls, these young girls, arranged in a semicircle under a ginormous baobab tree. And each of the girls was sitting, and the woman was sitting at a treadle sewing machine, moving this brightly patterned cloth back and forth beneath the needles. It was a really appealing tableau all by itself, the brightness of their clothes and the brightness of the cloth and the chattering girls, and they were laughing, and this huge, beautiful tree giving them shelter and shade. But what happened to me in that moment was an instant flashback to Gleason Street in Mexico, Maine, and our neighbor, Mrs. Gagnon, who did piecework for the local shoe factory. We called them shoe shops, but they were factories that did a lot of manufacturing on site, but also put out piecework to people, women mainly, in the local towns. What Mrs. Gagnon did was she enlisted the help of her daughters and some of the neighborhood girls, including me and my sister Kathy. And we totally adored Mrs. Gagnon, and we loved helping her. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't like, oh, let's let the kids do it. It was a real skill, and it had to be done exactly right. And it was a skill in which I took great pride. Our job was to stitch the toe end of a moccasin with that kind of winding stitch with rawhide. I think there were Bass Weegians, although they maybe weren't called that then, but it was that type of moccasin shoe. It looked just like this. I don't know if you can see that. And our job was this part. This is the part we sewed. It had to be done just a certain way. And there was something about these girls in this little village in Benin doing their own piecework in this place so far from where I grew up. It just bowled me over and reminded me, as so many things do, that we all belong to the same human family. So with all this in mind, I want to share with you something that I've come to understand about writing. I don't have another area of expertise. I'm not a historian. I'm not a scholar, but I do know a thing or two about writing. And one of those things I know about writing is that it's an act of empathy. And by empathy, I really just mean the ability to imagine yourself as somebody else. This is what writers do every day as we create characters who are often very different from ourselves. Sometimes we do research in order to find that empathy, sometimes a lot of research. For my current novel in progress, for example, I took a machine tool course at Southern Maine Community College. My husband teaches there and hooked me up with the machine tool guys. One of my characters is a machinist, and I felt that I needed to walk a few paces in his shoes before I felt I really had the authority to create that character. So there I was last fall, just me and 12, 19-year-old guys learning how to run a milling machine and read a micrometer. I learned firsthand how loud the machines are. I learned how a piece of metal feels in the hand. I learned how physically demanding it is to stand in front of a machine, concentrating for dear life for an hour or more at a time. And for that same book, I also researched bird intelligence. And I met some truly remarkable African gray parrots who can label dozens of objects, tell you what color they are, and count them up to 8. I met them in a research lab at Harvard where I learned what a parrot's voice sounds like. I learned what it feels to have a parrot sitting on your shoulder, that delicate but very present weight. They weigh a pound. And I was so bowled over by these birds, I could do a whole talk just on those parrots. So yes, writers do a lot of research, but honestly, mostly what they do is listen to everyone, to the lady behind us in the supermarket, to the guy yelling gibberish on the street corner, to our coworkers in the break room. In other words, we listen to fellow humans stumbling through their lives and telling their stories in 1,000 different ways. In this dawning era of previously unheard stories, or I should say previously underheard stories finally being heard, the practice of empathy is a good idea for writers and non-writers alike. We're not all writers, but we are all humans, and all humans love stories. It is how we have communicated since the dawn of time. Whenever we hear the words, guess what? We pick up our collective ears because news is coming, story is coming, change is coming, danger is coming, gossip is coming, something is coming. To listen is a great start, but to imagine is where you make those deep connections. To imagine with real effort and sincerity what it might feel like to be the person telling this or that story. I cannot ever have the firsthand experience of walking the streets of our country in a Black body or a Native body or a transgendered body, but I can try to imagine what that might feel like. I practiced that today when I was listening to the different speakers and panels. And because I told myself to listen hard, to listen with imagination, to listen with empathy, those stories are going to stay with me longer than if I had listened to them in a different way, if I had just heard them but not really listened. Yesterday, I was reading a newspaper article about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, when the Greenwood district in Tulsa, a prosperous Black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street, was torched by a huge and terrifying white mob. Its only survivors are now over 100 years old. It's a story that until now was pretty well scrubbed from history, deliberately scrubbed from history, microfilms destroyed. Even many Tulsans didn't know about it. Even many Black people didn't know about it. But stories, wow, they have a way of persisting. One of those survivors, a 107-year-old woman named Viola Fletcher, testified in front of a congressional committee a couple of weeks ago. I still see Black men being shot, she said. Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forgive this history, but I cannot. I am 107 years old, and I have never seen justice. No one cared about us for 100 years. We and our history have been washed away. Her voice was steady and calm and strong. This was a very old woman telling her story, testifying in both senses of the word, testifying before a committee and testifying before us and God about what happened. And it was my job as her listener, especially as her white listener, to not just hear her, but to imagine what it might be like to be her right now telling this. The aches and pains that must surely accompany her advanced age, her dimming eyesight as she looked through her little rimless glasses at her testimony. She was wearing these big earphones, I assume because her hearing is faulty. She appeared to be in a wheelchair. And I'm thinking, how hard must it have been for her even to get to Washington, to navigate all those physical obstacles? Also, she had on a beautiful ring and a lovely jacket, and she was wearing lipstick. I could imagine her looking into a mirror that morning, applying it herself, that feminine fuss that she still had. In other words, I tried to imagine as much beyond her words as I could, because listening with imagination is not just writer's territory. It's everybody's territory. And the more we try to do that, not just on days like this, in conferences like this, but in our daily lives, and the more we do that, the better these stories can be remembered, as stories are meant to do. We can't fully wash anything away as long as stories live. And if you are a person telling your story, don't underestimate its power. You cannot know who your story is reaching and what your story might mean to them. The listener might be a daughter trying to connect with her widowed mother in Seattle, Washington. The listener might be two college students holding hands in Constitution Hall, finding solace in their grief. Your listener might be a white lady in Portland, Maine, trying to open up beyond her defenses. I would like to end with a poem that knocks me over every single time. And don't worry, it's not by Rod McEwen. It is by Sean Thomas Doherty, and it is about storytelling. It is called Why Bother? Why bother? Because right now, there is someone out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was really gorgeous. And I so appreciate your kind of thinking through the whole day, as well as talking about your experiences as a writer and as a storyteller and as a listener. We can take some questions, and I think, let's see, we did. Okay, we've got a thank you. There was somebody who wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
And I don't know if they are still. Please post in the Q&A, or if you can access the chat, either one will work for us. I was just, while we're waiting, I was just kind of compelled by all of the sorts that we were talking about earlier, just the kind of the multiplicity of stories and of that were coming out of Maine that we often don't kind of expect maybe to come out of Maine, or we don't listen, perhaps maybe that's more accurate, when they're coming out of our state. Like, for example, you know, the queer stories panel, those stories, and like the work that Wendy Chapkus is doing, and the work, and Kathleen and Erica, like kind of bringing those to the fore, is also like really is important work to do. As much as it is for us to listen, we also have to like kind of get those, as you say, you have those. It's important for the storytellers to tell the stories, because otherwise they won't constitute the larger set of stories.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why, days like this are really important. I learned so much today that I did not know about the Maine experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was, and a really, really amazingly diverse group of stories.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple of things from Ellen Taylor, who's a colleague of mine at UMA. She has taught your book as well.
Well, thank you.
She says, I agree that deep reading and listening is an act of empathy and imagination. Also, she's a poet. I should put that out there. Having taught your book in many contexts, I can also attest to how many different populations relate to it. Yeah. And she says one of her students, who was an incarcerated Muslim man, was so taken with Father Bob and his sock puppets.
Really? Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay. Oh, well, this is a great question, Ellen. She says, I agree there are books for every time and place, and we don't always find our match. Given this, I wonder if Monica would admit or not that she ever chooses to stop reading a book if it isn't working for her. As someone who shares an Irish Catholic childhood, there is some guilt about that act of abandonment. That's
Okay, I will tell you, I will sometimes give a book 3 paragraphs. That's it. I just don't have time for this anymore. I used to say, well, I'll give it half of whatever, but life is getting shorter, and there's a lot of books out there. So no, I do not. That is not where my Catholic guilt lands these days at all.
Uh, I actually read 80 pages of a book the other day, and I will not say what it was, and I had to abandon it.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
got that far,
totally.
and I was like, I'm sorry.
If the writing is really good and the story is kind of slow, I will absolutely stick with it. Or if the story is riveting and the writing is just kind of serviceable, I'll stick with it. But if it's bad writing, I'll give it a page. That's it.
Um, I don't
I,
see, I see, well, okay, Ellen gives her thumbs up in a form of hurrah. Um, I don't see anybody else, but it could be that like total Zoom fatigue at this point.
I get that. It's been a long day.
Yeah. Um, oh, okay. Here's Jane Whiteside, who says, I think the biggest story that someone has to tell is when one is in a hospital or healthcare, when one is stressed and vulnerable. Some faculties and providers are better at letting individuals and families tell than others. Healthcare providers also have to coordinate with the facts. My mom and dad went to different facilities and had opposite experiences. Any training, especially for certified nursing assistants?
Hmm.
Thanks. Okay, yeah. I don't know, Monica, if you have any thoughts about.
Well, one of my first jobs out of college was a nursing assistant, and I worked at it was called Walrick Estates, and for old Portlanders, the building was on the corner of Emery Street and Danforth. I think Waynfleet owns it now. Big brick mansion, and it was a wonderful job. And talk about stories. And we were trained to help them and do this and that. But really, honestly, and I think in healthcare this is very true. A lot of our job was just to listen. Especially when you have people who are vulnerable, and I don't mean just old people, but if you're in a hospital, you are automatically vulnerable. And listening is a beautiful skill to have for anybody in the health area.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, and here is somebody who asks, how do you recommend that we best center the storyteller when retelling the stories? That's a great question.
Oh my gosh, isn't that interesting? Um, well, I just think acknowledging where you got the story. This person told me such and such. Um, stories do change with the teller. Even if you say, I heard this guy from the Passamaquoddy tribe this morning, and he was telling me about potato picking and da da da. And I will tell this story to somebody, and it will be not exactly the same story that the man told this morning, because we're human beings, and anybody who played that game as kids, telephone, where you just take the same thing, and at the beginning and the end, it's a completely different sentence. But I don't know what that means exactly. But I think, yes, acknowledging where those stories come from is really important. Um, I don't think anybody would argue with that.
Yeah, I don't know if the person is trying to get at the issue of appropriation.
Oh, I see.
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Um, but but yes, I mean your answer certainly addresses
Yeah.
that issue.
Well, I
And
think that if
yeah,
it's
go ahead.
an appropriation, I think that, I mean, clearly I'm not going to have a black narrator, or I just don't have that lived experience. But if I have a character who's not, anything, who's not female, who's not white, who's not in her 60s, who's not from Maine. I mean, that's all my characters. So you have to, writing is an act of imagination and empathy, but I think it behooves you you don't just make it up. You talk to people. That's why I did even something as ridiculous as, um, this, I'm not going to hurt the machinist's feelings if I, didn't do my proper research on machining, but that's what I do as a writer. I need to just, it's to acquire the authority to think as somebody else. And weirdly, most of the research I do doesn't end up in the book. It's just a way of feeling that character enough to know what they're going to say. It's a funny thing, but I think I do know what they're getting at with appropriation, and I think that writers do need to be careful um, about taking a story that's really not theirs to tell. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably what that was about.
Yeah. Okay. So we're now getting a few other questions. One person asks, were there other experiences in Benin that reminded you of Mexico?
Oh my gosh, that was such an amazing trip. Well, there was something small townish about the whole thing. We were working with, I was just a tag along, but my friend Denise was evaluating a really successful malaria mitigation program it was 5 years old, and she was going to, evaluate how the program went because it had been funded through World Bank. And it was one of the few programs by NGOs that the money was directly given to the health ministry in the country. So the whole thing was done by them. It was set up by them. It was imagined by them. And it was the nicest group there was a pharmacist and a doctor and the woman who ran the ministry, a lot of women in these places of this. That really surprised me. There were a lot of women in positions of authority there. And there was just something kind of clannish about the whole thing. And we sort of, I felt like we kind of understood each other because we were both like from really small rural places. It's nothing, it's very hard I'd like to write about that experience someday. I mean, I did do one piece about it, but there was a recognition of like small town people, I guess, recognizing each other. It was quite an amazing thing.
Thank
and
you.
The spiders, honestly, they would hang in the trees. Really, I'm telling you, they were this big.
Maine has pretty small spiders.
Yeah, I know that now.
Our spiders are small. We have to just own that. Okay, so 2 more questions. One, not all stories are uplifting. Some narratives today are actually quite pernicious, especially political ones. How do we deal with those?
I do not have an answer to that. Just like everybody else, I'm appalled and shocked and discouraged. And I think it's very hard to get the truth out there right now because the only truth, because social media is kind of the way we communicate now. We're just communicating with people who already see the truth the way we do. I wish I had an answer for that. I can only tell you that I find it deeply disturbing.
Yes. And one other question, can you tell us a little about your next book? Something with parrots, perhaps?
I'd be glad to tell you about my next book. It's I just sent it off, in fact, to my agent. She'll send it back with 4 single-spaced pages of revisions, so it's not remotely done, but it's done for now. And it's about 3 characters who form an unlikely friendship. It's thematically very similar to some other things that I write about people making families out of spare parts. And the 3 characters are Violet, who is a 22-year-old woman who has just gotten out of prison for vehicular manslaughter, and Harriet, who is a retired English teacher who did a book group in the prison. And Frank, he's the machinist, and he is the widower of the woman that Violet killed in the accident. And they meet under interesting circumstances on the outside, and become a kind of an alliance of sorts. That's what it's about.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
we'll look forward to that.
Thanks.
Okay, yes, Ellen says she can't wait to read that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I can't wait to see it in print too. And my publisher was just sold to another publisher, so I have no idea what's going to happen.
So what are we like thinking, like 2022?
That's probably stretching. It'll probably be 23 is my guess.
All right.
We'll see.
Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up? It seems, I think we've got, I think I have, yes, I have looked at all of them. All right.